Hey everybody, my name is Nick Ravel and I play viola, and I created DragonScales, unique 3-octave scale and arpeggio play-along system in all keys for violin, viola, and cello. Now I'm a professional performer. I have a couple Grammy nominations with my string quartet, public quartet. I've recorded a lot of albums, and I gotta say I find DragonScales really helpful, really effective at targeting physical warm-ups with pitch and rhythm practice. So that's why I created them for everybody to use. I just think it's so useful. If you're new to DragonScales, I'll link to a fun intro video about how to get it, where to get it, all that kind of stuff in the description. And also a link to the first video in this tutorial series where I talk about the major and the minor scale, a little bit of how to use DragonScales properly and effectively. But in this video, the second in the tutorial series, we'll be talking about the advanced scales, including the whole tone, both diminished scales, the chromatic scale, why I think they're useful, why I included them, why they're tricky. And so if you are into this, let's pluck that like button and subscribe, and let's jump right in. So why did I include these scales in this book? You know, when I was a kid, young student learning to play viola, I pretty much only practiced major and minor scales. I practiced them with tuners and drones and metronomes, and DragonScales effectively combines those tools into one thing with the play-alongs. But none of my teachers ever told me that the reason we were playing those scales so much is because the music we were playing, pretty much all the music from the Baroque, the classical, and a good part of Romantic era, can be broken down into major and minor scales. That's like the building blocks of that music. So it makes sense that we would be learning the sound, the physical motions, the muscle memory on our instrument in the form of scales, so that when we approach those pieces, they're easier. However, I found that after a certain period in time, let's just say roughly mid-19th century and later, a lot of music relies heavily on other scales. They're either atonal, or they shift keys center so much that there's a lot of passing tones. There's not necessarily a sense of this is a major scale type moment. So whole tone, diminished, and chromatic scales are more often used. So if we want to approach those pieces with that same level of dexterity and same built-in awareness of the sound, we need to practice them. And that's why I included them in this book. If you've not practiced them before, they can feel really awkward at first, specifically because of the way your hand needs to cross over onto new strings. When we play a major scale or a minor scale, let's do a major, we're used to one going straight across from one string to the next. So for example, those two notes are right across from each other. We find that easy. But in the case of a whole tone scale, you can't just go right across because there's no perfect fifths in the scale at all. I have to actually go up by a half step from where I was on the previous string. And I have to repeat that process for every string crossing, whether you're going up or down. And that can be very, very foreign feeling. Also, these scales have no real tonic feel to them. They have no real root feel, so it can be easy to get lost in them while you're practicing them. So we'll talk about how to work on that as we play through these. So that's why I included them in DragonScales. Let's talk about the whole tone scale. Here's the notation in DragonScales for whole tone. Let's talk about fingering real quick. Because of the nature of the scale, there's going to be a different fingering than the major and minor scales. What I like to do is I like to just go 1, 2, 3, 4 on one string, and then hit the next string, also 1, 2, 3, 4. Basically, keep doing 1, 2, 3, 4, knowing that you're not going right across, because as we talked about, there's no perfect fifths. You're going to be shifting up by 1/2 step per string until you get to the third finger on your highest string, and that's when I like to do the one and only shift in the whole tone scale. 3-octave whole tone scale, just one shift. Unless you include the little half-step shifts as shifts, but this is the big shift. So why don't we just hear, let's just go through the half notes in the play along. You can hear what that's like. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to actually try and sing the root as I play through this. This is challenging. I might mess it up. But what that does is it helps me stay grounded in terms of where I am in the scale. Because whole tone scales are a repeating pattern of whole steps, it can be tricky to remember what the tonic is. You know, it's like, have I reached the last note of the scale? Do I need to come back down yet? Or is there still more? You don't really want to have that feeling when you're playing. You want to know where you are and where you're going. So if I start to get lost, I'm going to sing the root. Trying to hear this shift. And now we're back down. So that's what the one octave, just the one cycle of the whole tone scale sounds like on half notes. As you can see, there's obviously a whole set of rhythms, so set your limit. Remember from that first video, set your limit, set your rhythmic limit. Don't go faster than you can handle. I did want to demonstrate just one piece from the repertoire that features the whole tone scale. This is by Claude Debussy. It's from his Preludes, Book 1 for solo piano, and it's called Vales. All whole tones, just 6 notes in there. Okay. So that's Vales. Other composers that really like the whole tone scale, just a couple, are also Bela Bartok, Thelonious Monk. I mentioned Claude Debussy uses that a lot in his string quartet, in La Mer, which is a very famous piece he wrote. So that's whole tone. Moving on to diminished. Diminished comes after whole tone in DragonScales. It is sort of the bridge between the whole tone pattern and the chromatic pattern, where chromatic is just all 12 notes in a row. Every note is a half step, whole tone being every note is a whole step away. This one is a mixture. So there's 2 versions. It either starts with a whole step and then does half step and repeats that pattern all the way up to the octave, or it starts on a half step, does a whole step, and then repeats that pattern. So there's both versions in here. And just like in the whole tone scale, there's no real sense of tonic, so it can be helpful to sing, just like so you don't start feeling lost in the scale on the way up. And why don't I play for you this first cycle again, just so you can hear how it sounds, and I can tell you about what the fingering I do is. Start out on 1. Step to get to the new string. I do 4 again, same thing. Pull back a little bit. I like to shift up after 4. Maintains the spatial pattern in the hand. Pull back. Shift after 4. Shift after 2. And then back down. Same way we came up. So again, it's a longer scale than whole tone. If you can't feel that sense of tonic, you might get lost. So that's the fingering I would recommend. Rep that features the diminished scale. Sorry, let me just get my, here we go. Includes this lovely piece by Joan Tower called Wild Purple for solo viola. And it's a very challenging piece, very virtuosic. And there's vast portions of the piece that just are diminished scale, that's it. So let's check out this bar at the top, 139. This is kind of at the climax of the piece, and it is literally just a diminished scale. Both versions, back to back. So that's just one example. There are plenty of examples in the rep, and that kind of covers a diminished. So let's move on to chromatic. Chromatic is the last scale in the DragonScales book per key. And obviously chromatic covers all the notes. It's every note in the octave. And this makes it awkward physically because you're going to do a lot of shifting. You're not going to cover a lot of ground. You're going to run out of fingers, essentially, before you have to move to the next string. So there's a lot of shifting. I personally like a fingering that involves more shifts than slides, because sometimes you can kind of get away with, you know, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4. You can kind of slide around, but I actually like the shifting style better. 1, 2, 3, shift. I like that version better, so pick your fingering. This is the longest scale in the book because it's got all the notes, and therefore it takes the most time. This one I find is the most dangerous in terms of getting lost. You know, especially if you space out for 1 second, you forget what that tonic sounds like. You don't know when you're supposed to come back down, especially if you're playing it from memory. So I would say use the notation, mark in your fingerings, and get creative with bowings as well. So I think the most famous example of piece using the chromatic scale, you'll recognize it immediately. So it's the Flight of the Bumblebee, and just look at this. I mean, even looking at a chromatic scale on paper is so awkward. There's so many accidentals that it can be really hard for your brain to sort it out, especially if you're reading a piece. Or even if you're kind of on your way to memorizing a piece, but not there yet. It can just be distracting from the sound. So that's why I think the notation, especially for chromatic and diminished scales, is really useful, because you start to work in the visual sort of flavor for how it looks on the page. So as I said in the last video, if you find yourself practicing the same pieces kind of over and over again per day, you can randomize it. Use a die or some dice to pick the key, and then the scale, because there's 6 scales within each key. And then that way you won't get stuck on major, you won't get stuck on minor. Maybe practicing these scales will make you less intimidated to try a piece that uses them, which are generally considered more difficult. Again, my theory is that if you practice the building blocks of these sort of more advanced pieces through these more advanced scales, then approaching the pieces will be easier, and you can play more music. And that's kind of the point, in my opinion. So that's all for this video. I want to hear more about how are you enjoying or hating DragonScales? Do you find it helpful? Are there things to improve in a potential revision? Let me know in the comments. Tell me all about it. Thank you so much for watching, and stick around, stay tuned rather, for the upcoming videos in the series. We're going to cover the arpeggios, which we've not done yet, getting creative with the play-alongs, which include playing in intervals, the difference between diatonic and parallel intervals, improvising patterns, rhythms, and grooves, and potentially double stops. Maybe, maybe not, we'll see. So hit that like button, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and happy practicing.